Okay, welcome to another episode of Black Representation in the Curriculum, where we have conversations about teaching, equity, and belonging. So I'm truly thrilled to have our guest today, Dr. Lisa Riegel. So we chatted about talking about Black representation. And so I'm really excited to have you learn, connections between that and her work. Welcome, Dr. Riegel.
Y Thanks for having
And
me.
it's great to have you here. I figure let's start by having you tell the audience about yourself and what you do, and then we can go from there.
Okay, sure. So I was a teacher for 9 years. I was a high school English teacher, and I also taught journalism, and then I moved into an administrative role at a career center. And then I actually was really interested in leadership and ended up at Ohio State and did my doctoral work in leadership. But I was really interested more in the human side versus like policies and structure. So I started really studying human behavior and how do we lead people, whether it's leading students or leading adults, how do we leverage the science around motivation and engagement to help improve academic outcomes and social outcomes. And then I started really getting into the idea that real change actually starts in your brain. And so understanding the actual brain science of engagement and success and stress, and how do we then create what I have coined a neuro well culture. So I think a lot of schools are struggling in today's world with, more incidents of student behavior problems, academic disengagement. And so what do we do in order to leverage the neuroscience to engage the human system? And that's teachers and students. And so my work now, I do a lot of consulting work, leadership coaching. I work directly with teacher teams to help them start to really shift the culture of their school and the practices that they use, whether it's teaching practices, curriculum they're using, instructional and assessment practices, so that it aligns more with the brain science and how we need to create a setting or context that's safe, supportive, and proactive.
Wow. You know, it's being in the academic space and in school of educations, it's such an interesting combination. You looking at you said neural wells or neuroscience. Is that something? Out of curiosity, is that something was that part of your research?
Um,
Um,
So
Leadership.
my research and my doctoral work when I was at Ohio State was really focused more on the social sciences, like engagement and motivation, adult learning theory, that kind of piece. And then since I probably in the past 5 or 6 years, I used to teach at Ohio State, but I'm not there anymore. Um, so over the past 5 years or so, I've really dug into the neuroscience and how do we take the research that's out there, the neuroscience research, and apply it in education.
Oh, okay, awesome.
So I'm not
No,
doing direct science research, I'm doing more application into the context of education.
okay, that makes sense. So, what connections do you see in terms of the work you do and looking at Black representation in curriculum too?
Yeah, so I think that the way one of the key things that our brain needs is a sense of safety and a sense of belonging. So one of the things I talk about in NeuroWell is the importance of creating kind of a collective identity in schools. And that collective identity is sort of like when we're here, then our identity as a student here in this classroom supersedes our differences. So we get a collective identity. So social science actually researched this because they looked at the diversity movement and they said, you know what, by and large, we've failed. Because if you go into organizations or social groups, you still see people who look like each other hunkered down in these groups. You don't see like the stock photo of like people from different backgrounds. So they
Right.
said, well, what are we missing here in all this effort we've made for equity and inclusion and all of this? So they started studying the military and they said, okay, the military soldiers end up with really strong ties that last for years and years, even though they're from completely different backgrounds, races, ethnicities. And what they realized is that they had this sense of collective identity. So when you are a soldier and you're with your peers in a platoon or wherever you are, then you are a soldier first. All the other pieces that make you you are less important in that context. So that collective identity becomes how you start to interact with the people in that context. And so therefore they kind of all become sort of your people, and the difference aren't as pronounced. And in schools, I see a lot of kids who just do not feel a sense of belonging, whether it's due to race or due to mental health, or neurodivergence, or whatever it is, or just I'm the poor kid, or I'm the whatever. It's, we see a lot of students who don't have that sense of collective identity. And when we don't have that, it's kind of like when you walk in to a meeting and you see people and you're like, oh, these are not my people. You kind of shut down. You sort of go to the back of the room and disengage a little bit. Where if you walk in and you're like, these are my people, you're open and ready to engage and collaborate and offer your ideas. So I think in schools there's two problems really. Is one is just that culture of not having a sense of collective identity. So you have students who are already disengaging. And then when your curriculum looks nothing like me, sounds nothing like me, is not tied to anything that's familiar in my world, then that's another place where I can feel like school doesn't really belong to me, or I don't belong in the school. So I think that from a neuroscience perspective, that sense of belonging we create in culture and in curriculum and assessment and all the things that we do in schools, um, can lead students to feel a sense of a lack of intellectual safety. And when we have a lack of intellectual safety or emotional safety, our brain goes into overdrive to try to keep us safe. And when our stress system takes over, the part of our that we need in school to be successful, those executive functions that are up in the front part of your brain, are dampened or shut down altogether. And so it's really important to think, how are we making sure that there is Black representation in curriculum, and that we are actually really trying to build a sense of belonging and collective identity? Because if we don't have that, the students who don't feel like they belong are not going to be able to access the mental powers they need to do effective learning. And we see achievement gaps.
So I want to play devil's advocate for a moment because when I hear the word collective identity, I'm very tempted to think that yes, schools do have that, right? But oftentimes the collective identity, or I even see even people who are in the schools agreeing, yeah, we should have a collective identity, we should have a melting pot, right? And but the problem is the way we think of that collective identity we see usually means we have a collective identity that supports our agenda, right? And then we tend to attribute collective identity to Black students. So expand on what you mean. What is this collective identity you're talking about that would support, for example, our Black students? And how
Sure.
would you, yeah. Hmm.
So I think that what a collective identity is that it's not from the top down necessarily. It's a sense of feeling a sense of belonging. So if you think about like The Breakfast Club, that movie, The Breakfast Club, students, they had like, that was an 80s flick. If you haven't seen it, it's really good. But it's
Yeah.
like, you've got the jock, you've got people representing all the different cliques. So
Hmm.
it wasn't broken down by race, but it was broken down by groups, social groups. And they come together, and through their day in detention, they actually coin the phrase the breakfast club. And then once they start to feel like they're all part of this breakfast club, then they start opening up and sharing. And so collective identity in schools is where everybody feels a sense of belonging, where when they walk, it's not, I am walking into a culture that may or may not accept me, that I'm part of actively constructing that culture. And I think that, there's a lot of things that schools can do to set the conditions for that. But it's important that we
Mm.
don't just use words, that we use
Yeah.
actions. So, for example, I talk about setting up your classroom as a learning community. When you come
Uh-huh.
in, instead of having it be, this is my classroom and you need to fit in here, we need to share that load and say, hey, we are a community and everybody has a responsibility to everybody else. So, start by saying we're a learning community. You can choose not to learn and put your head down, whatever. I mean, if it happens a lot, I'm going to talk to you about it, but you
Uh-huh.
take that learning away from someone else. And so you create this sense of we're all in it together. So then if somebody's acting out in class, I could come up and be like, hey, Catherine, do you think what you're doing is making it hard for other people to focus? And most times, like, yeah, probably. Okay. Well, can you stop doing that? Because our focus together is to learn, and you're not the main character in the story. We're all supporting characters. And then you talk about like what makes in a learning community, what makes a good learner, what makes a good community member, and you have actual actions. Culture is formed through actions, not words. And so I hear schools talking about how inclusive they are, but I don't hear them actually, or I don't actually see it and hear it in practice. So collective identity is a sense of like when I'm in this group, I am part of this group and I belong. It's a feeling, it's a sense of inclusiveness. And so, for example, like Ohio State, where I did my doctoral work, and my husband's a graduate of Ohio State. If you go anywhere and you yell OH in Ohio, somebody will yell IO on the way back.
Mhm.
And
Right.
so we have, chants and handshakes and traditions and routines that we do. And when you're doing those things, you are connected to people because you're both Buckeye fans. You're part of Buckeye Nation, and it means something to be part of that. So, like, we were
Right.
in Germany and we went to we saw a game on in a bar. So we stopped at the bar and somebody was there watching and yelled OH and we yelled IO and we drank beer with them all afternoon. And we had a great time and we felt a sense of belonging. Our stress systems were relaxed. We weren't like weird other foreigners. We were like together within that moment. Now, when we leave, those strong ties don't stay, right? Because we had one afternoon with these folks, or like Breakfast Club, one afternoon. But a school has 185 days to create this culture of belonging and this sense of everybody, when we're here, we're Spartans first or we're whatever first. And they have 185 days a year to do that. So they have an opportunity to help build, like just like the military does, really strong ties between people who are very different.
Yeah. Makes sense. It's funny, listening to you talk reminds me of HBCUs, right? Where you talk about, we have the same thing that you mentioned, especially when I think about the needs of Black people. But what I'm curious about is because what it sounds like you're also talking about is, from the top down, really embracing the culture. I'm so curious as to what you see. Um, what do you see schools and school systems, would need to do? And what have you worked on them with to create that collective identity?
Yeah. So I think one of the problems we see in schools is that they tend to adopt a middle class business culture values of that. And And then if people, I've worked in a lot of schools that serve, high poverty areas, deep urban or deep rural areas, and the values clash doesn't work. So, heard of, having to code switch or having, so when you walk into the school, you have some values clashing between what I hear and see at home and what I'm expected to do here. So when I work with schools on culture, what I really talk about is, okay, let's think about what you're trying to value. So let's say one of their values is we are responsible. We're going to take responsibility for our actions, that we want people responsible. Okay. What does responsibility look like? What do I see? What do I hear if people are being responsible? And that's where you start to give the opportunity for some different perspectives to come in, because maybe what it looks like to be responsible in one culture looks different than another culture, or in one demographic looks different than another. So you start to create lots of different ways to demonstrate responsibility or kindness or safety or whatever the characteristics of a good learning community are. Um, so that way, when I come in there, we're all united under the idea of we're kind, but what kind looks like
Mm,
is multifaceted, but we're recognizing all of those different expressions of kindness or responsibility or whatever it is. So being able to have kind of a unified goal or concept, but then giving people the cultural flexibility to be able to exhibit those qualities in a way that's aligned with their backgrounds and their lived experiences.
well, so many. So I'm thinking of so many questions. So okay, so let's from based on what you said to talk about responsibility and kindness and what it looks like to one culture. And I'm going back to when I was a teacher because I taught in the classroom, high school for 16 years. And so I remember moments, not just and I'm guilty of it too, but also seeing on an administrative level when people talk about culture, right? And this culture is a certain way. A lot of it depends on, one of the things I'm started looking at is what we call motivated thinking, right? In terms of oftentimes the tendency would be to think, oh, well, they see responsibility that way, they see kindness this way, and it becomes sort of like a negative thing, right? Where it's hard for uh, anyone on top to take that leap. So, what do you say to people who you want them to value it in a positive way, right? Value these values of the culture in a positive way, but they can't quite get themselves to take the leap. I'm wondering what you've seen and what kind of challenges you've had to work through to help them to get from A to B.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the problem, because schools tend to adopt a middle class kind of business values and culture feel,
Mm-hmm.
um, it is I think part of the problem is that we look at other cultures that aren't automatically aligned with that value system through a deficit lens. And so, for example, I hear people blame parents all the time for student troubles. And the reality is that if you think of any behavior, so from a neuroscience perspective, behavior is the intersection between biology and context. So our biology is responsible for how we perceive our reality, like the actual biological mechanism to create our perceptions. It's responsible for how our brain makes associations between our environment and how we should feel or whether we're safe or not. So there's a whole lot of biology going on, but our context actually impacts our biology.
Mm-hmm.
And so when schools start to blame outside forces for behavior of students, I always say, hold on a minute, because behavior is biology and context. So if you are creating a safe bubble and a
Right.
strong context that promotes, safety and supportiveness and proactivity and kindness and inclusivity, then you're not going to see those behaviors because the biology of the brain is not it's not going to associate your context with negative outside forces. So I think, understanding that those forces come in to the school in your brain, and it's part of how your brain is processing. But if you have context that's full of positivity and that has this sense of collective belonging, then you're calming that brain down and you are mitigating some of you're buffering some of the things from the outside that kids are bringing that are causing disengagement or poor behavior. So I think some of it is taking responsibility for the environment that we're creating, and and being intentional and strategic about creating a safe, supportive, proactive environment for the adult and for the students. I think it also comes into, again, actions speak louder than words. So like, how are we using discipline system? Are we punishing biology? If kids come in and they're dysregulated and they don't feel intellectually safe, they don't feel emotionally safe, they don't feel a sense of belonging, their brain has escalated the stress levels. And from a biology standpoint, once you hit the panic button, the thinking part of your brain is told, like, hey, go get a cup of coffee, we're in danger, we'll handle it. And then the unconscious part of your brain takes over, which is why, like, if you've ever been super angry and then you calm down, you're like, "Why did I even say that? I don't even believe that." It's because you weren't there. Your thinking part where you have characters and morals and everything else was out having a cup of coffee. It was your limbic. And I see in a lot of schools, people asking students like, "Well, what were you thinking?" or "Why did you do that?" or, and digging in, talking to this part of the brain, the front part, when that's not who was directing their brain at the time. So it's evidence of a lack of understanding of basic brain biology, but it's also an inability for them to discern where their role in context comes in place. So if you understand biology, you can say, okay, you know what? This kid's freaking out or he's completely disengaged. Something in this environment is triggering his brain to feel unsafe. So
Mm,
what can I do to make him feel safe so that he will be able to keep the thinking part of his brain functioning? The second piece is motivation. So motivation is a math equation. It's actually expectancy times value. And just like in multiplication, if either one of those are negative, then the outcome is negative motivation. And
right.
so Expectancy is I believe I can do this. So if you don't have an intellectually safe classroom, if I'm coming into your classroom every day and I can't do the work that you're putting in front of me, maybe every day the bell work is like grade level work and I'm behind. And so my introduction into your classroom is, welcome to the class. You're the dumb kid again today. That's going to elevate my brain to say, you're in danger. This isn't your place. You don't belong here. And it's going to make it harder for me to learn and think and remember. Um, so there's that expectancy piece. The other piece is the value piece. Why do I need to know this? How do I need to learn this? And so I think when we think about our culture and our context in school, we want to think, how are we leveraging a equation of expectancy and value? How are we making this a place that kids value being and that they value what they do while they're here? And how are we also setting up a positive context where kids believe they can do it? And if you have those pieces, you're gonna have motivated and engaged students.
Wow. I still, it's interesting because when I hear the word biology, I'm still picturing, um, you know, again from a top down level. I still picture it being greeted with negativity because it's still, for me, when I think about it, it still says, well, you're to blame, right? And I still see people addressing it and thinking about it as they're to blame, they're the problem. Now, when you mentioned just being intentional about these changes, I mean, I've seen schools be intentional, right? I've seen schools, for example, private schools. My son having been there in his elementary years, I've seen where private schools were intentional about the same thing. But when you come with a school that's predominantly black, even with similar problems, I mean, some albeit the resource and the money minus, there is less intentionality. I'm just wondering how we can turn this around so that um, schools understand that we're part of the problem, right? And that we need to become part of the solution and to think about it as, oh, it's not their fault. I'm just curious as to, if you can, highlight how one might go about doing that. And or I know we had talked briefly about some differences you saw, that might not happen in white schools because capturing this on an emotional level is so important as well, right? Because sometimes people are reacting on an emotional level, but expect students to react on a cognitive level, right? That's where dissonance comes in. Can you expand on that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, that it's really important to understand the biology piece so that it's not misinterpreted, because if you truly understand the biology, there's no way you can look at it negatively because all of us share the same biology. So, essentially what happens in your brain's like a big corporation, and just like in a company, you have like a president's office and you have some different departments that are involved in creating perceptions and determining whether we're safe. 80% of the traffic in our brain is unconscious. It's below our nose, and it's in a part of our brain that does not know time and can't tell a story. So it's just making associations between what my experience is right now and what my experience has been in the past to help figure out should I be scared. So there's some different departments. So we have a vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs down your neck, around your heart, your stomach. It's kind of like a systems manager. And its job is to say, is my heart beating okay? Is my stomach emptying? It's also that's called interoception. It's also monitoring proprioception, which is where is my body in space. Kids today, and actually adults are losing proprioceptive input powerful because we don't move, we sit, right? So proprioceptive input is developed by rolling down hills and going on merry-go-rounds and sit and spins and doing things where your feet are not on the floor, where your body has to keep track of your body parts. When our vagus nerve doesn't know where our body is, or when we have like stomach issues or heart issues, or like just anytime our systems aren't operating, it will send messages to our data center. Our data center is our thalamus, and I call mine Harold. He's my data manager. So Harold's job is to talk to my vagus nerve and then to look around in the environment at all the different sensory stimuli that are coming in. And then he does is he goes into our sensory memories, and our memories are not like a library. They're actually fragmented into multiple parts of our brain. And when we want to make a meaningful memory, our thinking part of our brain has to order up these memories, and our brain spits out all these fragments. And then the front of our brain has to stitch them together to make meaning. So the only memories that our thalamus has access to are sensory memories. Don't know time, can't tell a story. So this is why if you're selling your house, your realtor says burn a candle that smells like cookies, because our herald will smell in this house that we're looking to buy, will smell cookies and will make an association with comfort and home, because most of us have positive memories about cookies or celebratory memories about that. So so he ends up getting those sensory memories, getting the information from the nerve. He writes up a report and he sends it to our security monitor. I call my security monitor Bob.
Mhm.
So Carol sends Bob a report, and Bob says, okay, should we be stressed or should we not be stressed? If he thinks we should be a little stressed, he taps the button and sends a message up to our CEO, the thinking part of our brain, that says, hey, we're not sure how to respond, so we need you to weigh in. So at that point, you're a little bit agitated, your body's in an alert phase, but your brain is still the thinking part of you, your morals, your character, your decision making, your logic, that's still active. If Bob reads Harold's report and it says it's bad, we're in trouble, we're in danger, he will hit the button harder. And the message that goes up to the thinking part of our brain is go get a cup of coffee, leave the building. Harold and I will take care of this. We'll call you when we can bring you back in. And so that's when you start to see stress induced behaviors. And the thing is it has nothing to do with your age or your race or your ethnicity or your background. That is how all human brains work. And so when I go to schools to talk about neuroscience, we start at the teacher level because teachers are regulated and they lose their cool. So the question is what is the association that Harold is making and what is the underlying fear that this brain is trying to protect you from?
Mm.
For example, when I was a kid, my parents were divorced and my dad was always late. And so I spent the time sitting on my front stoop waiting for my dad. My little 8 brain made an association because I didn't feel good, right? That didn't feel good waiting. Made this association between lateness and love or worth. So all the way through into my 20s, if I was running late, Harold would say, you're not he would associate it with they don't love you, they don't care about you, and he would ramp up my stress system. So, like, if I was running late, sometimes I would get angry or anxious where, like, it took me a while to calm back down, and I would miss out on fun because I was just so agitated. Well, once I understood that link between time and worth, I was able to talk from my thinking part of the brain down to Harold and say, Harold, don't associate those two. That's a faulty association. So if I'm a teacher in a classroom and I see a student that's struggling, acting out, angry, whatever, then instead of thinking this is a conflict between me and the student, if I understand brain science, what I should do is look at him and say, huh, something in this environment. Is it the tone of my voice? Is it something I said? Is it other things that are going on? Is it a really noisy environment and the kids already escalated? What is happening in this environment that his herald is associating whatever's going on with danger? And again, when we get back to curriculum and Black representation in curriculum, if I am always in a situation where I don't see myself in this curriculum, maybe there's cultures or experiences that I'm reading about that are very foreign to me that don't make a lot of sense, then Harold is going to start to associate. Once again, here's another example of where you don't fit in. Here's another example where you don't belong. Here's another example, and that sense of otherness makes negative emotion. So it's going to associate those 2 things together, and it's gonna send a message in that child's brain that this isn't the place for you. It's gonna send stress chemicals that either shut the child down or escalate them. So if a person understands that biology, then there is no judgment involved. It's a science experiment. It's okay, something is going on right now that is causing
Right.
big brain, has nothing to do with who this child is or what kind of personality they have, it's the biology. Does
Right.
that make sense? Does that clarify it some?
It does actually. It really helps, especially when you brought it down to the teacher example and the student example. It was really helpful to see from a student perspective that their absence sends a message that you're not important enough, to be in this curriculum and to be talked about in this curriculum and to get to know. Um, and from the teacher's perspective, that makes sense. I'm curious as to what other aha moments you've seen teachers have to work through to make the connection between their role and what they do and what it means for the child. What aha moment? What other aha moments? Um,
Yeah, so a couple aha moments come to mind. One is that I work with teachers a lot on how do we how do we assess students in a more differentiated way? Let students show you how they know any way they want to. And I remember even as a teacher myself, I said to my students, I said, okay, we had read a novel and I said, all right, here's what I wanted you to learn out of this novel. It had to do with character development and a couple of the themes and why they were important, how the author constructed it that way. And I said, so I created kind of a rubric that said, here's what I wanted. This is why we read the book. You can show me that you know any way you want, or you can take a test. So I had a student who came up and said, "Can I do a dance?" And I was like, "Oh, Lord." I was like, "Well, I said you could do it anyway, so now I have to say yes." So I said, "That's fine." And I said, "But what I'm gonna tell you is you could come up and dance the Nutcracker. If it doesn't align with this rubric, this is what I'm grading you on. So make sure that whatever you're doing is making a clean connection between the rubric and your dance or whatever." And she said, "No, I've got it." And she loved modern dance, which I knew nothing about. So she came in and she did a brief explanation of modern dance, which was super interesting.
mhm,
Then she had taken each character and created a move and put a little chunk of music with it. And she showed us the moves and she explained why those moves were representative of the change within those characters through the novel. Then she strung the music together and she actually did a dance. And then she interpreted the dance for us and how it represented the theme. So, like, by tying into something she valued and her lived experiences that she spent hours and hours outside of school practicing dance. She actually ended up in New York City after graduation. She was able to really get into that book. So it wasn't even just that the curriculum, because when you think about some of the curriculum we read, how close is it to any of us? Like, David Copperfield from, the Victorian eras or so there's always kind of a leap. So how can we tie these cultural ties together, these learning preferences or values in what we ask students to demonstrate? And so I started doing a lot more of this free choice for students, and I was amazed and had so many aha moments of how much better my relationship with kids became because they got to show me a piece of them and I got to appreciate it. And so it's just, I think teachers are so when we started moving to data and student data being a measurement of teacher quality, the whole system shifted away from I teach kids to I teach content. And so, like, even I'm sure if there are teachers listening, some of them will be like, "Yeah, that's great and fine, but I gotta get them ready for the test." Is that really what we're here for? Because if we are doing actions that repeatedly tell kids, "You're just here as a data statistic for me. This is about me and my teacher quality rating, and you're just a cog in the machine," then they don't feel a sense of belonging. They don't feel a sense of inclusiveness, like I'm supposed to be here. They're just a data statistic. So we have got to start to shift the system back to I teach kids content, not I teach content kids. And so, some of those kinds of practices were aha moments. The other thing is some vicarious moments. There was a example of a young kid who had been abused by his father, his biological father. So he had been put in several foster families, and he ended up at kind of a boarding school, sort of orphanage type boarding school. And he was doing really, really well. And then he got to a new teacher, and the wheels came off the bus, and he was disengaged, misbehaving. He was just really, really struggling. So he was there, his dad came in for a visit, and the psychologist was sitting in there, and he happened to know a lot about the brain science and how perceptions are formed and all of that, and, he was sitting there, and the dad was wearing Old Spice deodorant, and the psychologist was thinking about his dad and going fishing and, like, having all these positive memories. Then he looked at the student and realized the student was not having positive memories because that's was Harold was associating all this negative fear-based emotion. Well, he went back into the classroom with the student and realized, "Oh, the teacher wears Old Spice deodorant." And so he asked the teacher, "Would you be willing to change your deodorant to scent, something without a scent?" And the teacher said yes. And they had kind of a restorative meeting to help the kid understand why he was hating that class so much. Had nothing to do with the teacher. It had to do with how his brain was associating the smell with his past. And once they did that, they were able to start moving that kid forward. So I think for me, the aha of that moment is when we truly understand the neuroscience and we apply it and we don't make assumptions and judgments about people without really thinking through that neuroscientific lens. um, we can really redefine problems that we see in front of us and reshape how we handle those problems.
Wow. That seemed like such I mean, one of the simpler changes I imagine,
Yeah.
uh, to spot. I'm so curious as to, now that you mentioned that, I know we had chatted about safety and the role of safety. I wondered what else you came across, when it came to, student safety and learning, especially in the classroom.
Yeah. Well, I think schools spend a lot of time thinking about physical safety, but the really important part is not just physical, but also emotional safety and intellectual safety. And so, one of the things that I see in schools a lot is that in classrooms that are sort of disorganized, noisy classrooms, that, teachers are raising their voices and they're yelling and again, if somebody's yelling at you, then Harold's going to associate other times you've been yelled at and that volume and that tone with negative things, and it's gonna escalate your stress system. So it doesn't serve to calm down a classroom. Um, so I see a lot of emotional safety issues for students, in the little people classrooms, like in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade. Teachers have learned that movement is important, but, like, what they end up doing, though, is they end up having a wiggle break when the kids are out of control. So it almost becomes a punitive. Like, "You guys can't learn, you're not focusing, you're not functioning, you're out of control, so we're gonna do this wiggle break." What I try to teach people is to do things proactively. Like, we know that people's attention span is not 40 minutes long. It's not an hour long. And I always use the example of, like, if you go to the gym and you get on a treadmill and you're like, "I'm gonna run for a half hour." You're running, 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 and then you start to get tired and you're like, "Oh, I've gotta be close to a half hour." And you look down, it's like 7 minutes have gone by, and you're like, "I'm never gonna make it," right? School is like that for kids. It's the never ending treadmill. So chunking the class into like 15-minute learning sprint, then take a little 2-minute, 3-minute brain break, 10-minute learning sprint it, take a 5-minute break, 18-minute, just chunking the class into almost like interval training can make kids more intellectually safe because they learn how long is 10 minutes? They're like, "I can do anything for 10 minutes," right? They can focus on something and then, if you have a timer up and they can see how long they have left, they can be like, "Okay, I'm losing focus." And they look up, they're like, "Oh, I only have a minute and a half. I can do this." And then they get a break and then they go back. And so there's, routines that we can use that are aligned with how our brain learns that can make us sick because when we feel efficacious. I can do this. And when we get value out of what we're doing, we're motivated. And so I talk to teachers too about, the solution to pollution is dilution. And so if you have kids who are super negative, the solution to that is positivity, not sarcasm, not more negative reinforcement. So if you have a student who's coming into your class with a lot of struggles, who maybe doesn't feel like they belong, who feels not very competent as a student, and so they're already gonna feel a little bit intellectually unsafe. You've gotta shower them with positivity, make that environment one that's different, that starts to fuse Harold and Bob, because if you confuse Harold and Bob, they'll send a message up to the CEO that says, "I don't know. I'm faced with this math stuff, and I'm really uncomfortable because I don't think I can do it, but this is a place where I guess I always do it. Like, the teacher's always supporting me, and I always get it done." So now I have 2 varying perceptions, right? So it goes up to the CEO to say, "Hey, we've got good and bad associations, so we need you to weigh in on how we should respond." And then the CEO of your brain can say, "Okay, you can do this. we're going to do this. Harold, calm the body down. We're fine because in the past we've done this before, and the teacher will support us, and in this context we can be successful. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. You were bringing up something that I've been thinking about because part of my approach to educating teachers is, really helping people to understand the connections with their own upbringing, their own experiences, um, and how those sometimes even can be trigger for approaches they may take in the classroom. I'm wondering how you've come across that in terms of, things that teachers themselves have had to, address, confront, battle before they could even, sincerely, meet students' needs. Because, even I've had to think about that for myself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think what I talk a lot about is that you have to have self-awareness and self-regulation if you want to have self-control. And those three elements are critical for happiness, health, and success. So you got to be self-aware, you've got to be self-regulating to keep Harold and Bob from taking over. And when you have that, you can have self-control. And then at that point, your behavior is the direct result of your decision making. And so one of the things I talk about with teachers is, I teach them how perceptions are formed and how Harold puts the different things in the brain together. And then I have a stress triggers worksheet that I give them. And it has lots of different things like, loud noises, when somebody gives me feedback, when I feel like I can do something, when, somebody says something mean to me, when I feel excluded, just like all different kinds of like what are things that upset you. And then we talk about, okay, it's not about the what, it's about the underlying fear. It's about the why. So look at the things on this that are the triggers that cause high stress to you. So like with teachers, a lot of times it's performance-based stuff, right? Teachers are perfectionists, they were good students, they tended to be people who were afraid of failing, who were afraid of disappointing people. So we start to talk about, okay, you can go to a therapist to figure out why you're that way, right? Like that's not what we're trying to do, but recognize having that self-awareness that my frustrations come when I feel like I will be perceived as failing. And so we have a teacher whose classroom's out of control and they know it and they can't get the students to learn, they get angry. And then great the students because the students aren't doing what they're supposed to do. They're not following the same value system, right? They're not trying to please you by performing. And if that's your fear is that I'm going to not be loved or not be seen as a good person or a good teacher, or I'm going to be professionally disrespected if I'm not perfect. If I fail, and yet what's interesting is that we then complain that students can't stand failing, that students can't do a productive struggle, that students, but the reality is teachers are terrified to try things because by and large, in the work I've done with teachers, they are pleasers and they're perfectionists. And so by understanding that underlying fear, when they start to get angry when things aren't going well in the classroom, they can start to recognize I'm not actually angry at them. I'm angry because this is going to make me feel my biggest fear, which is I'm in a not good at my job or whatever. So building some of that self-awareness can really help them change how they respond in situations. Um, and, I think leadership plays a huge role in it because we say that we want teachers to take chances and do things, but then we don't measure that or evaluate that positively. And so, you know, if we want to set up a culture of experimentation and differentiation and student choice and all these other things, well, then you can't buy direct instruction curriculum and expect everybody on the same page at the same time on the same day. So those things don't fit together. So I think that teachers, my heart goes out to teachers because I feel like they are given a lot of conflicting expectations and that you hear them say all the time, "I just need more support," or "I don't have time, I need more support." It's like they're trying to implement these things that don't fit together, and then they have kids who, they've moved from teaching kids to teaching content, so the kids' brains are shut down because there's like, been on the treadmill too long, and it's just a recipe for disaster, and then it creates negative experiences for the student which then create an association in their brain between all of the different kinds of sensory stimuli in a school and negative emotion, whether it's I'm yelled at, I'm in trouble, I'm a bad kid, I can't do this, I'm not fast enough, whatever those messages are that Harold associates. And then it becomes a real problem because then you have kids who just don't come to school.
Mm, yeah. Wow. Speaking of kids now, I know we had talked a little bit about parents, um, because a lot of times, kids not coming to school have to also do with challenges of parents. And I know that I believe you said you've done some mediation in terms of working with parents and connecting them. I'm curious as to, can you highlight some of the challenges that parents have had, whether it includes or separate from, especially in relation to working with schools and
Sure.
school?
Yeah, I think one of the so I have a book called Stop Doing What Doesn't Work, and it's about parent engagement. I think it again it goes back to values and it goes back to mutual respect. So when we look at parent relationships with schools, we say in the school end we use the word partnership. We want parent engagement and parent partnerships. But a partnership is when both parties have a purpose for being in that relationship and both parties have power. And when you say again, like it's not about words, it's about actions. When I look at interactions between schools and parents, it's not a partnership. It's a subordinate relationship of we're going to tell you what to do and then we're going to be mad at you when you don't do it. And that's where I was talking about earlier. I see a lot of blaming of it's just not appropriate. So I was working with a school. They called me in because parents were physically assaulting the teachers. They were angry. It was a rough neighborhood, a rough area of town. And so we did a series called Find Your Voice. And so parents come in and that we'd feed them breakfast and I think we did it like every 3.5, 4 weeks. So they would come in. I partnered parents up so they had a buddy and they could continue the conversation outside of the sessions. But we talked about like the idea of okay, you're angry and you have a right to be angry, right? The school had had like 5 principals in 3 years. It was a hot mess. They had staffing issues. It was your worst case scenario of a deeply urban school, like the worst case scenarios you read about. So I said, "You have a right to be angry, but the way that you're expressing your anger, like, what do you want to accomplish? If you want to accomplish to tell them you're mad, you've succeeded. They know it. But if you wanted something to change for your child, you've failed because nothing's changing for your child. So let's figure out how to find your voice, how to interface with the system, right? Because you think in this particular area where it was a very high poverty area, the parents spend a lot of time talking to institutions and they don't receive a lot of respect from those institutions. So they've learned over time, you've got to be loud or you've got to get in their face, you've got to get their attention because being polite doesn't always work. So we spent time really helping parents to say, okay, what do I want to have change? Who do I have to convince to make that change? And then how do I find my words to make that person make the change? And that person's going to respond differently than maybe you would if somebody was asking you to make the change. So we spent some time doing that. We also spent some time because there was no trust between the parents and the school. It had
Mhm.
eroded over time.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, the community is interested in having a strong school. So let's go out into the community and figure out, if they'll support the school. So the first thing I did was we started a PTA, and the president of the PTA was homeless. She couch surfed. She had 9 kids, and so I said to her, I'm gonna come and pick you up. Would you just give me a day in your life? Let's drive around. Let's go see what you do. And she was like, sure. So we drove around, she showed me all these places, we stopped in, I met some of the people that helped her and that she interfaced with, and then I went back to the school and I said, "Why do you do the literacy night on Thursdays? You always do your events on Thursdays." And they're like, "I don't know, it just works best with our calendar." And I said, "Well, do you realize that that's the day of the week that the food pantry is open?" And I said, "So you're asking parents to come here and to have one meal or to skip coming here and go have a week of food." And I said, "So you're also telling them you have no idea what their life is like or what their
Right.
community is like." And I'm like, so again, it comes back to that, like, you should be celebrating parents for not coming. It would be a bad choice to come to a literacy night at the school and then your kids are hungry for 6 days. You would be a bad parent if you did that, but they don't know that because they didn't reach out. And then we would go to the local businesses and I would go around and drop off, little cards that would just give a little positive story about a student and some upcoming events. We started having the business people come to the school on the nights that they were trying to do, like, we had, one woman who did really cool braids, and we said, "Would you do a demonstration of a really neat pattern or whatever?" And she said, "Yeah, sure." So then when people are out in the community and it's like, "Are you going to the school for this event?" "I'm not going there, I hate that place." "Well, I'm doing a demo there." "Oh, well, I'll be there." And then we but then what we had to do was we had to train the teachers, and we had the teachers to, first of all, not be afraid of the parents because it was a dangerous area of town, and so and the teachers did not live in that area of town that worked there, and so we had to train them on how to deliver customer service basically and have conversations with the parents. Um, and when we started to do that, then all of a sudden things started to shift. And, for example, when people were eating their dinner on the nights that we pulled them in, the teachers, a lot of times you go to schools, what do you see? You see the teachers standing in the corner waiting for the parents to finish or doing something. We said, no, no, no. You go sit at that table and here's conversation starters. And you're going to sit at a table with parents. You're going to introduce yourself. You're going to, start talking and break bread with them, start to develop some relationships. We also had teachers that went and started to serve food at the food pantry so that for parents who wouldn't come into the school, they could see the kid and be like, "Hey, is that your mom? Oh my gosh, hi, I'm so and so. It's nice to meet you." And so they were meeting them on their turf. Um, so I think those are the kinds of things that when you start to look at parent engagement in a different lens, you start to really develop some strong relationships with them. But and it's an us versus them, which I see in schools across all demographics. That's not just an urban problem. It's everywhere. Even with IEPs and how we talk to parents when their kids are struggling. Like it's just, so so that's the kind of, but I think again when you wear a lens of brain science and understand what's going on in that parent's brain, and especially too, like even in some of the really deep rural areas that I've worked in, sometimes those parents that you're calling in because their kids are acting out, those are the same people who sat in front of you in that same chair when they were a kid. And so, they have all the baggage of the past of how they felt as a student, and now this is one more example of how they're a bad kid or all that kind of psychological baggage that's in the background. And you don't have to psychoanalyze people, but just understanding if you see someone who is dysregulating, who's starting to get snippy or starting to get stressed or starting to cry, you can recognize that this may have nothing to do with you. It may be that you somehow set up a condition that is reminding Harold of painful things. And so we understand that we react differently and we can react with more empathy. Like something is dysregulating. So now my role isn't to be right. My role is to figure out how I can calm this environment down so it's safe for that person.
Wow. Wow. I mean, these are great and important solutions. And unfortunately, it reminds me a lot of just you know, how we often don't consider the poor, for example. Um, because I can't help but say, when you mention the pantry night, but if this was a private school, there's no way you'd be organizing a meeting without considering what those parents' busy schedule look like, right? There's just no way you're even going to schedule it or you're going to choose a time. You'll be thinking, I wonder what will work for these parents, right? Because you want them there. And so I'm wondering what else you've come across that people have really had to change and shift in their ways of thinking, especially when it comes to observing how they may treat someone with money and versus how they might treat someone without money, or even how they would treat someone who is white versus how they would treat someone who's not.
Right.
What are some other things you've had to really work with them
Well, I think
understand?
one of the what you just said is so right. We think about like, oh, well, they have like practice till this time, or they have this or they have that, so we can't have it until this time in the evening. And you know that when you're working with the working poor, there is an assumption that they're lazy, that they're not working. You know, when you're in a high poverty area, it's like, "Oh, none of these people have jobs, they're just laying around." And the reality is they're really busy because they're trying to get food for their family. I mean, they're busy, they have things going on, right? And some of them are working poor where they're working 2 or 3 jobs. They don't have at 45 minutes to drive to the school, to sit with a teacher, to talk for 10 minutes, to turn around and drive back and pay for daycare and gas and all this other stuff. It's not that they don't care about their kids, they don't have time. And so I think when you start to look at it through that different lens, it changes things. Because I think there are a lot of inappropriate assumptions that we make about people who are poor or people of different races and what their value systems are, and that's just unfair, and it doesn't lead to a good partnership. The other place where I see, and this drives me crazy, is truly with working with parents of students with special needs. And you know, when we think about kids, you know, like I was talking about earlier, how like our brain is like those filters are formed through every aspect of our life, right? So while we're in school, and school does have the ability to create this protective context, this protective bubble where things are consistently positive and building you up so that that can override the negative filters that we come from our past. But those filters, you know, our brain is going to always look for association. So like I even think of students with autism, and it's like I feel like schools try to get accommodations and things in place so that kids who don't fit the system can tolerate the system for 8 hours a day, right? So
Mm,
it's about tamping down, about control and compliance versus
right.
about really working with the parents, because I guarantee you the parents have found things at home that help keep their child regulated. And they may be that are a little outside the box for like the typical school, but like if we work together to be able to say, okay, well, this works at home, how can we adapt that in a way that it will work in schools? And then how can we work together to continue to message to that child, hey, this is like that. Like this is just like when you're at home. Because if we message that, then Harold goes, oh, okay, this calms me down at home. So this is going to calm me down here and make link. But what we end up doing is creating systems that don't talk to each other. And then we call the parents like we're tattletaling on their kids. So
Right.
you like the way we construct behavior plans, and it's all about like when did your kids screw up, how often did they screw up, versus how do we work together to build agency and skills in your kids, and how do we celebrate together. Like every day parents and schools should be celebrating together, and I just don't see that as common practice, and that's something that I really push hard on, and I have tools that schools can use, and the thing is, at the end of the day, they work, because the ones we have don't work, and the reason they don't work is because 'cause they're not aligned with how we learn a new habit.
That's flat crossed my mind from what you said there because it's interesting because I'm even thinking of my own experience. I mean, and I've had good experiences, but I've also made observations in comparing, and having taught in a public school and having taught teaching teachers and listening to stories. It's interesting because one of the things I even talk and write about is oftentimes these same practices that you're mentioning for the working poor and for these tougher districts. I see it in practice very easily, in areas where there's a lot of money, right? Where people would very freely, make sure breakfast is provided or, and it's not, the attitude is different. You don't feel like you're doing a favor, right? You feel like um, you're just there to be a good, provide good schooling. That's part of providing good schooling, that these structures are already in place to make sure students have breaks, to make sure they have water, to make sure they have snacks, to make sure they have breakfast. And so it's really interesting. Just it's reminding me again just to see how the attitudes are different because of the assumptions we make,
Yeah.
about people.
Yeah, well, and the assumptions that we're making become the filters that Harold pulls on. So if we have a certain set of assumptions, we can look at two people in different contexts doing the exact same behavior, and we can have a different emotional reaction to those behaviors based on how we're grouping the what we know about a person or the context that they're in versus our past experiences. um so yeah, there's definitely systemic inequalities. But I think at the and I also think that there's just a lack of understanding for kids today. In fact, my husband and I were just talking about this yesterday, about how the world is so different today. The media that kids consume is negative. It's about power. It's about othering. It's about let's manipulate each other and vote this person off. It sets up a world assumption in their view that
Yeah.
the world is dangerous and chaotic and people can't be trusted. And even for adults, we're starting to see, I grew up with wholesome shows about community and family and, Little House on the Prairie. You make a mistake and you say you're sorry and I'm Paul forgives you. And, it's just like these shows where it was about, wholesomeness and community. So my background was that people are generally good and the community cares about you and those kinds of things. In today's world, kids are growing up in a very different space, and we are starting, between the constant negativity on the news and the tribalism in our politics and the social media stuff. There are so many negative filters that we have that people are forgetting to look for the good too, because when we're only looking for the bad, we miss the good. There was a social science experiment where they had 2 basketball teams, and you had to count how many baskets the different teams made. And then at the end, the researcher said, "How many baskets?" And you tell him the answer, and then he says, "Did you notice the giant gorilla that walked across the basketball?" And, like, more than half of the people didn't even notice. And so what I would contend is that there are gorillas all around us, beautiful, kind, wonderful, thoughtful gorillas, and we don't even see them. We
Yeah.
only see the negative because our brain is primed for that. So one of the things that I think is so important, and that's why positivity in schools is so important, is finding ways to appreciate the students in front of you, to find joy in them, and like when I was talking about show me how it gives me an example to see a child in a different light than maybe that's the kid who never does well on my test, or that's
Yeah.
the kid who can't sit still, or that's the kid, looking through that deficit lens, or these are the families that don't care, trying to really challenge our assumptions and look for the gorillas.
Wow. That's funny. That's one of the gorilla experiment is one of the examples I use to help
Yeah.
people see what they don't notice. I'm so curious, even for someone like me who prepare teachers, I found myself literally just there's certain books I don't use, realizing what we thought teachers needed, is not necessarily what I think they need. What would you advise us for how we prepare teachers in terms of preparing them to work in these spaces? One of the things I've done, I'll just tell you quickly, one of the things I've done is um, I recorded myself. I create curricula, Black representation, and then I record myself and implementing this with Black homeschoolers, with parents there. And it's been interesting so far. It's a current study I'm doing as well to see how teachers respond. Because I felt as if people don't necessarily get to see an exemplar of what would be a good exemplar, right? Um, but when it comes to preparing teachers for different predispositions, what type of advice would you give, someone like myself, educators?
Yeah. I think that it is a travesty that we do not have deep neuroscience coursework. And you don't have to become a neuroscientist, like you don't have to study super complicated stuff, but thinking of, when we're doing lesson planning, how do you apply brain science to that? When you're doing classroom management, how do you apply brain science to that? Because, we started the whole science of reading movement, which I think is, again, it's great that we're finally aligning how we teach reading to how the brain learns to read. But this isn't like the brain has learned to read this way always. It didn't just all of a sudden evolve into a brand new structure and function. It's just new to us. And so I feel like when we understand how the brain works, how the brain learns, how the brain engages, what the stress system does, then sudden we understand the medium that we're supposed to be using to sculpt a future ready brain, right? And so with the work that you do, I think what I see with teachers a lot of times is everything that is presented to them comes through a filter of I'm already overwhelmed, right? So they see things as this is one more thing now I have to do. Well, I can't do thing, and they push away new knowledge because they're too overloaded in the moment. So I think understanding that brain science can give, like, just like the importance of it's not about just now you need books that have different colors of people in them. That's not what this is. It's about setting up safe structures for kids, and that's important not because it's just, hippie hooey stuff. It's important because the kid's brain can't learn if they don't have a controlled stress response. So I think having, and I think that leaders need that too. So I just wrote a book called Aspirations to Operations that's a leader's to how to leverage the brain science for the adults in the system to help move transformation forward. Because I think a lot of things, even I've worked with some folks who are really focused on English language learners. It's like the teachers are like, I can barely keep up with my general education kids that are I just look at it homogenized group, right? Well, I can't handle all these like, different languages and different learning styles and disability and different, racial implications of things. Like it's just too much for them. But I think when you bring it all down to a shared understanding of belonging and collective identity, then all of a sudden you've got these glasses on that are sort of a neuro well lens. And all of a sudden things that you're teaching become the tools. And they're like, "Oh, thank goodness. Now I understand how I can do this here, how I can do that here." Just seeing it as one more thing on my plate.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I completely agree. I think and not only for the teachers, working to help teachers to be even self-aware of who they are, but also for students. I find for students it's really helpful to
Yeah,
help them know, oh, you're a 13-year-old brain and you're a 16-year-old brain, and this is where you are and this is where you're not. These are things you be careful of depending on where your brain is.
yeah. Well, and it's, for teachers, for leaders, for students, just for people. We need self-awareness, and that means we have to understand how our brain works because there's people walking around out of control with their limbic system driving the bus, and that is not the part of the brain you want driving the bus. But need self-awareness. We need those self-regulation tactics so that we can calm that body down, calm Harold and Bob down. And we need self-control where this part of our brain, the thinking part, the president of our brain is actually leading the other departments of the brain. And so across the board, I think schools should be teaching this brain science to kids and not as separate standalone lesson that, somebody pushes in, teaches, and then nothing happens. The teachers have to support the brain science with the routines and the way they teach and thinking about how they assess, and it's not a million new things. It's just taking what you do, putting these glasses on and saying, okay, is this creating intellectual safety? Is this creating emotional safety? Is this creating a sense of agency and control and power sharing for kids so that they feel a sense of ownership to the learning? And if it's not, it usually doesn't work. And so you can start see things through just a little bit different perspective instead of just throwing jello at the wall and hoping something sticks.
Right. Wow. I know you said you had worked with the Appalachian culture.
Yeah.
I'm so curious about, what that was and what that means in terms of your work, and who you were working with, if you don't
Yeah,
mind
so
talking.
I work on and this is a great example of when you don't understand the people that you're serving. So I grew up in a suburban area by Akron, Ohio, and I didn't have rural experiences. So I ended up I was on a contract that was called the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative. And a lot of people don't realize that like a third of Ohio is Appalachian designated. So all the way down to the southern part up the east side of Ohio is all like right in the foothills of Appalachia. So we have a huge Appalachian culture. Um, and so this project was about college and career readiness and access for kids in Appalachia. So we worked with 26 different districts, and It was so interesting because as we're creating these college, you know, kind of advertising for kids, like, you should do this college and career planning. What are we doing? And it was a challenge because a lot of the communities didn't have a lot of jobs or industry. So it became really tricky because in Appalachia, it's one of the only cultures in the United States where your status is gained by how many generations you've lived on the land. And so you have people who have a lot of political and informal power who live. It's based on not what they're whether they're educated or whether they work. It's based on where they live and how long they've lived there. So the threat to me coming in to say, if you get good grades, you can leave and get out of here and go to college. Parents don't want that because their family status will be diminished if the child doesn't come back and there's no industry there for them to come back to. So we started looking at the messaging we were doing and we were like, okay, so first of all, our messaging's about leaving the community, which is a huge risk for families. And then the second was, we would say, well, you can work really hard so you can go to school and take on debt. So you can work really hard so you can get a job, so you can get a paycheck. And there were a huge number of students who had no one in their family that had a job. They had lived through Social Security for generations, and they didn't have a concept of what is a job. What does it look like to have a job? Why would I wanna get a job, right? So we had kids asking us questions like, "Why would I wanna do that?" Their plans after high school or after, whenever, were to do exactly what they saw in their community. They would have some kids, they would work together in their community, and, so we had to change our messaging and really think about what are we asking people to do and who would want to do that. And so we started really talking about entrepreneurship and the idea that you can come back to your community and you can build your community. You can build roots here. You can bring business here. You can start your own business here. And when we started shifting the language around, all of a sudden kids started getting interested because they saw college wasn't being sold to them as an escape out of poverty. It was
Mm,
being sold to them as a way to build their social capital and ability to come back and help their community. And, I think it's also interesting because, schools tend to kind of ascribe to this individual, like competitive type of value system. But when you work in, some cultures are much more collective. People in poverty can be much more collective. They help each other out because that's how they survive. And so, having kind of that messaging, there was a program, this wasn't one I did, but there was a program where it was a college access program again, and they were trying to get more Hispanic students to go and participate in these college visits, and they couldn't get anybody to sign up. And what they realized again was their messaging was all about you can improve, so you can do better, so you can get out of here, so you can make money. And then what they started to realize was that when they transitioned that conversation to you can help your community, you can be more, impactful in your family, all of a sudden the buses were full. And so
right,
it's another example of where that values clash that we've been talking about, it muddies up a message, but the intentions are good and positive and trying to help kids get education, but the values lens that we wear as we talk about that, excludes families. And, and then again, it goes back to that sense of belonging. If the school is constantly sending out messaging that doesn't align with my culture, doesn't align with my family values, then I don't really belong here. These aren't people.
right. It's fascinating because sometimes even when we change the messaging, those values still remain, right? The fact that we see, you know, other people's homes as a place to escape from,
Hmm.
uh, and as opposed to where people want to be, you
Right.
know. The it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of what you said in the beginning when you mentioned the collective identity and where that comes from. Because given our current climate, it's very difficult for me to imagine without being there and knowing what's going on. Um, Even in a military setting, that the collective identity is as constructive perhaps as it was,
Hmm.
especially if it appears to be more top down now. I wonder what kind of havoc is being wreaked there.
Mhm. Well, and I think that's where, I mean, not to get into politics, but our country is very tribal at this point. Our politics are very tribal. And so that becomes just like the military used to be, that becomes a collective identity. You are part of that party, and then there are assumptions about everything about you. Um so I think it is a little bit dangerous when you think about the tribalism in our politics, because it does divide people, because it breaks down that sense of community or family even. Your family would have collective identity. You belong in your family, you're part of that, and we're hearing about families being torn apart because of political differences, which is really sad.
Right. Yeah, it's things change when they become more about control and compliance and
Mhm.
less about belonging.
Yep.
You could, yeah, the goals change, the outcomes change, and wow. Well, what do you want to leave people with? I know you had mentioned your books, and I figure we'll put the links also in chat. But what do you want to leave people with? What do you want to, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
So I work with schools, so if there are educators listening, I do keynotes, I do workshops, I work with leaders and do coaching, work with teams of teachers. But my real passion is to help people find their potential and find fulfillment in life. We're only on this rock for so many years, and we should be happy and healthy and successful while we're here. So that's really my mission. And Neurowell is a great book for parents or for educators. It goes through sort of all these contextual factors. It gives you some of the biology lessons to help you understand how the brain is functioning, and then it gives you suggestions for routines and practices in the classroom, instructional practices, assessment practices, disciplinary practices. And then there's a section for parents on how to influence positive change in the home. So, Neurowell is a great book to get started into really understanding that self awareness, self regulation, self control piece. And then, if there's any school leaders listening, we spend a lot of time with aspirational and inspirational ideas, but translating those into sustainable action and implementing them is tricky. And so, Aspirations to Operations introduces an 8C framework that I've used in schools to really make transformative change happen and then stick. And so it's a great book for leaders, and it's not just education focused. It's kind of industry agnostic. So even if there's people who are listening who are leaders in their work world, but it's not education, that book gives them the brain science information and is focused more on the adults and the human system in organizations. So, they can find me at LinkedIn, reach out, connect with me, message me, read the books and think of me if you wanna start really making some transformative change.
Hey. Well, Dr. Riegel, thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
being. This has been very insightful, and I want to say if you like this episode, please like it and subscribe so you can be alerted for the next episode. Thanks for joining.